really we can see, and that's on both sides. It's both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, that many of the soldiers really don't have a lot of training before going into battle. We actually see quite a bit of chemical warfare already. We have really not seen any Western countries coming out against the Ukrainians.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In a world increasingly shaped by geopolitical tensions and military confrontations, we turn to voices that resonate with experience and strategic insight. Join us on The Focus as we sit down with Royal Danish Navy Commander Anders Puck Nielsen. Anders is a seasoned maritime strategy and defence dynamics expert and a military analyst at the Royal Danish Defence College. You might know Anders from his successful Conflict and War YouTube channel, link in our show notes. With a career that spans pivotal roles within Danish security and first-hand experience in Northern European security matters, Commander Nielsen offers an unparalleled perspective on the evolving military landscape. Today, we delve into the Ukrainian Kursk Incursion, a critical juncture in the Ukraine conflict, and explore potential Russian military responses, including the controversial use of unconventional weaponry. Tune in as we navigate the turbulent waters of international military strategy and defense politics right here on The Focus. Anders, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anders, can you provide us an overview of the current battlefield dynamics in the Kursk region following the Ukrainian incursion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ukraine totally reshaped the battlefield, right, in here in the beginning of August, when this very unexpected, I think, to almost everyone, incursion into Kursk happened, and Ukraine basically took back the initiative in the war. They haven't had that for about a year, since the end of the summer offensive of 2023, and then Russia started the big offensive and have been pushing and basically having the initiative for since then. And Ukraine just totally reshaped the battlefield and how we need to understand the war, what's going on. So we still have the same picture basically in eastern Ukraine as we've had all along, that Russia is pushing, Russia is still moving forward. In fact, there are some signs that maybe it's even speeding up right now, that they are gaining ground a little bit faster than they've done in previous months. But at the same time, Ukraine suddenly has a bit of territory in Russia, and that both changes the way the front line looks and where the two sides will have to allocate forces, but also politically, it totally redefines what negotiations will look like. We can no longer have the Russians coming in and say, well, we have to acknowledge the new geopolitical realities, for example, because they will not be willing to accept the current geopolitical realities. So it's really a bold move from the Ukrainians, and we still don't know where it's ending as we're recording this. The Ukrainians are still, this is the third week of this offensive, and they are still moving ahead. They're still taking more territory.
And as from the way that I see things, the war really started as a sort of attritional grind once the Russians lost their initial offensive momentum and they got, defeated at the gates of Kyiv, and then they got rolled back in Kherson and Kharkiv. And then all of a sudden it looked something like World War I or something like the Iran-Iraq War. It was a war based on mass and not much maneuver. So now that the Ukrainians have pulled off this, as in Australia we'd say, swifty, and, a surprise, basically, they pulled it off in a very surprising manner as well. They've actually reintroduced maneuver in this war. How important is it for a smaller country like Ukraine to use and exploit maneuver as opposed to get suckered into a grinding attritional war that we know it can't win? Russia does have at least a 7-1 advantage in terms of overall military mass against Ukraine, right?
I think overall, I'd still say that it's a war of attrition. The
Mm,
thing is just that Russia had left this entire border totally unguarded. Really, it was extremely weak in this area, and that's what Ukraine exploited. I think the only reason they haven't done it before is because of political restrictions that have been imposed on them from
right.
the Western countries. That you can't use Western provided equipment to do this, and
Mm,
now that policy started to be softened after Russia's Kharkiv offensive back in May, and that sort of led to the situation we have now, where suddenly this seems to be a possibility for the Ukrainians. They did it. They've gotten away with it. The Western countries haven't really protested a whole lot about it. So and that caught Russia by surprise, and that's why maneuver warfare was a possibility. And of course, it's also because Ukraine had managed to just get better at maneuver warfare that they could do this and that they could introduce this element of surprise.
mm,
Um, and even though I say that, though, I will say I don't think we're going to see the Ukrainians being able to do the same thing in a counteroffensive in Donetsk, for example,
yeah.
because the Russian defenses there will just be way too strong. They're way too prepared for this. The minefields will be too massive, and so I don't think we're moving into really a maneuver kind of warfare overall. But in areas where the Russians are weak, the Ukrainians can use this.
Mm,
And then of course there is the whole question of, can Ukraine actually win a war of attrition against the Russians? And I don't know. I think it's, at least I'd say it's important that we don't overestimate the Russian ability to continue doing this in the long run. I mean, we really see signs of weakness also on the Russian side, and they don't necessarily have this massive advantage, because if they had a massive advantage, they would have won the war already, right? And they
yeah.
haven't done that. I think basically it's two very equal armies that are fighting right now. Yeah, so
Mm,
the question of attrition is who can continue doing this the longest. And I think
mm.
if Ukraine continues receiving Western aid, then quite frankly, I think the perspectives look better for Ukraine in terms of winning a war of attrition.
A lot has been said about the F-16s that had been promised quite some time ago and now are arriving in small batches to Ukraine. How important do you think these fighter jets are going to be once they actually find their way into operational service within the Ukrainian armed forces, especially in the Kursk incursion? I mean, the Ukrainians and the West to a degree have crossed a number of Putin's red lines. How many more red lines can Putin afford to have either the Ukrainians or the West cross before he completely loses legitimacy in the Kremlin?
Oh, that's two very different questions, the F-16s thing and the red lines thing.
Mm,
So I mean, if we start with the F-16s, then I think we need to see this more as a step toward a transition for the Ukrainian Air Force onto Western platforms, where the goal it's not, the 10 planes or something like that Ukraine has right now that will make the difference. But it's if they in 3 years' time can have 100 or 150 planes, then we're talking something that is really significant. And then, of
mm,
course, it's also about the weapons package.
yeah.
What kinds of ammunition will they get for these? And potentially, this could give them some standoff weapons that really can, where they really can challenge the Russians in the air. And I don't think we're going to see them a lot in Kursk, at least not for now. It's just too dangerous to bring them so close to the front line. They would be probably shot down by the Russians, and um, they don't have a lot of them, and the Russians would really celebrate that as a big victory.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see them more in a standoff role and probably more defensive here in the beginning. But the important thing is the perspective that this is Ukraine transitioning to Western platforms and to a system where there really is there's a lot of F-16s in the world that they could potentially get over time. And if we look at a country the size of Ukraine, with the location, the threat perception that Ukraine has, I mean, it would not be outrageous to have 200 or even 300 fighter jets like that. And that is possible with a platform like F-16. So I think there's an important long-term perspective in it, but it's not going to change the war dramatically in the short term. I actually think that's also why they announced so publicly that we now have the F-16s. It's because they know that there's not going to be something super spectacular that's just suddenly going to happen and everyone will know. If that was the case, then I think they would have sort of kept it a secret, and they would have let everyone guess what is it that we're seeing now. But they announced it, and I think it's because they wanted to sort of close that discussion and just say, well, we have it, our partners delivered as they promised, and we're going to see the difference over time. And then your other question was about the red lines.
Well, the
Which is
F-16s
also
were a red line, weren't they? They were a red line to a
yes,
degree.
they were, and it's interesting. We have this funny, you know, there's like this pattern where before something is decided, some kind of new system, for example, the F-16s, the Russians will say, if you give that, that's an absolute red line, and it's going to lead to massive escalation, and we can risk World War III and what have you. Then the decision is made, and then there will be it's totally changes, and the message will be like, it doesn't matter at all. Like, it will make absolutely no difference, and we will just shoot them down when they come. And then when we get close to it, then we will typically see like notes that, well, we already shot like 50 of them down, even though Ukraine only received 10, right? And so we have the like that. This seems to be the pattern in these things. And the interesting thing about the Kursk incursion actually is, I think, the degree to which we're seeing the Russians playing it down. Like the official messaging is really that it's not all that big a deal. In fact, it's not even really um, uh, an armed conflict. It's just a kind of terrorist attack or what have you. Putin has basically disappeared from public view in Russia. He was gone for over a week. Nobody knew where he was. Then he showed up again. He was on a state visit in, I think, Azerbaijan, and going around looking at like apple plantations and factories that produce sugar-free candy and stuff like that. Things absolutely unrelated to what's going on, basically to play down the situation and say this is no big deal, right? And I think the reason we're not seeing any kinds of big threats about escalation or nuclear retaliation and things like that is we're getting close to the point where they would actually have to do it, right? And they don't want to do that. The point about all this rhetoric was exactly to scare the Western countries into imposing these political restrictions on the Ukrainians. You can't attack into Russia with Western weapons because it will lead to escalation. Now they actually did it, and the Russians don't want to escalate.
It's interesting that you should say that, because from my observations, it really does seem that the Russians have painted themselves into a bit of a rhetorical corner here. They're good with the talk, but when it comes to actually following up with the threats, there's a huge gap between one and the other. So yeah, I mean, if they use the rhetoric as a device necessary to intimidate the West from supplying Ukraine with whatever is necessary for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, okay. But in the end, they are continuing to supply stuff to the Ukrainians, and it doesn't seem like the Russians have really that much of an answer to that, which then begs the question, is Russia actually intimidated by the West and intimidated by the support that they're providing Ukraine?
I think I'd say that actually the rhetoric has worked, right? We are 2.5 years into the conflict. We're still talking about red lines. There are still things Ukraine is not allowed to do. We have long-range strikes, for example, with the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. These things, that's still not allowed to do that into Russia until now. We haven't seen these large attacks on the place along the front line where Russia was weakest, exactly because of these limitations. So I'd say, I mean, I think it has worked actually quite well for the Russians for a long time. We're just approaching the end of where that really makes sense, because very slowly all the red lines have been crossed. But if there hadn't been all these red lines, then we might have seen all these things a long time ago. Yeah. So in that sense, we can say that it has worked. But at the same time, I think the Russians are keenly aware that they don't have a whole lot to escalate with at this point. The reason why the war has taken so long is that the Russians don't have any more they can throw at it, because in that case, they would have done it. So when it's so difficult for them to take a city like Chasiv Yar or something like that, we're not suddenly going to see them march on Berlin, right? They don't have right now what it takes to take on the entirety of NATO. So they have to try to keep things below the threshold where that would, actually happen.
We can't really. Well, I mean, we can try to call their bluff, but it would not be in Putin's interest for that bluff to be called, right? Not for Putin. Yeah. All right. So given the strategic importance of the Kursk Oblast, what measures do you anticipate Russia might deploy to counteract the Ukrainian salient? Would you be able to discuss any potential escalations and tactical adjustments that the Russians can make?
I think, to be frankly, the reaction we're seeing is that they are trying to double down on winning on the front line in Ukraine, where they already had a bit of momentum, and then they are trying to see if they can maybe use this as a kind of diversion of Ukrainian forces and see, does this give them some opportunities? I don't think they will be successful. Maybe we can discuss that later on, why I think the Russians are going to run into trouble on that part of the front line as well. But I think that's the initial reaction, not actually to overreact to what's happening in Kursk. Clearly, this is not something they wanted to happen. We've seen a lot of confused messaging out of Moscow, especially in the early days, of what on earth is going on here. But what we're seeing is by now that they don't feel in a hurry to actually throw the Ukrainians out again, that they can actually live with a part of the Kursk region being under Ukrainian control for quite a while. That they might try to turn this into another kind of front line where basically the war will be fighting we will have two parallel battles going on, one in the east and one in the north, and Ukraine will maybe struggle to provide manpower and supplies to both of them. I think the Russians will struggle about that as well, though. But it seems to me that that's what they're basically trying to go for, a sort of gradual approach where it will just get harder and harder over time. And then I think we're seeing that they're trying to expand the fighting force to also include the conscripts, which is a politically very sensitive topic in Russia. And Putin has straight out promised that would never happen. So they have to prepare the Russian population for an increased use of conscripts. So we're seeing a kind of an interesting messaging in the Russian media space, where it's really about downplaying the significance of this, trying to normalize the idea that, sure, we have Ukrainians in Kursk. I mean, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, we can deal with that. It's inconvenient, but it's not catastrophic, and Putin still has time to go to and look at apples and sugar-free candy and stuff like that. And then we have a lot of messaging about how it really the conscripts really ought to be part of the fighting. So they're trying to normalize this idea about using the conscripts and saying that this is really your sacred duty. It's the purpose of life to die for the motherland and things like that.
With regard to conscripts, for instance, there's been a lot said about the use of conscripts, that conscripts are not as good as normal soldiers, that they don't have enough training, experience, so on and so forth. Mums and dads don't like seeing their young kids that are, what, about 19, 20 years old running off to the battlefield. It's just not a good look overall. But we know from now the Russian invasion of Ukraine that mass has returned to the battlefield, that we in the West in particular, we're all suffering from manpower deficits. We've had these all volunteer professional forces now for, well, at least the last 25 years. And those countries, and I can say Australia is one of them, we have hollow units. That means we don't have enough personnel to man military units, which means that if they're actually called out at a short notice to do something, well, you'll be calling out a number of ghost battalions, if you will, because they're completely and chronically understaffed. So where do we get our excess? I hate to use the word manpower because that's now gender biased, but you know what I'm saying. Where do we get our extra personnel from if we cannot use conscripts? Because even in the public domain, conscripts and the idea of conscription is being bad-mouthed by pretty much everyone, even though we have a very strong case to reintroduce it in many countries, yeah?
I think we're actually seeing that, at least in Europe, in many countries, a return to conscription. Um, Here in Denmark, we're just also really boosting the conscript part of the army. We will have significantly more conscripts going forward. They will be serving a longer time. We will go to 1 year, which is a lot more than it used to be here. I think I'd say that in general, conscript units can be quite good. I mean, that they can definitely have qualities, and if we compare it to what else we're seeing on the battlefield, really we can see, and that's on both sides. It's both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, that many of the soldiers really don't have a lot of training before going into battle. The people that Russia is mobilizing currently for the conscript that sign contracts to go to Ukraine, they also mostly just have conscription, but it's just 20 years ago, right? So we will have people that are older in age, that not as fit as and where much of the military knowledge will be, they will have forgotten by now. So compared to that, I don't think that the conscripts are any worse. But what we will see probably is that they have less of the equipment that they would need for the types of operations. So they might lack tanks or infantry fighting vehicles. They might not have the artillery that they really need. So because it's just gone to Ukraine instead, and Russia might have to reallocate some of that to the front line, to Kursk, to the rest of the front line going forward, in order to make sure that such conscript units actually can solve the task.
Okay, Anders, based on your experience, what can you tell us about the size of the Russian military engaged against Ukraine, and how does this compare to the total active forces that Russia claims to have? Now, going back on what we were saying earlier about how you did say that it looks very unlikely that Russia would be able to take on NATO, it does look increasingly like that this is the case. So how much of Russia's total force is now invested in Ukraine? I would imagine it must be somewhere up around about a third of the total force. Would that be correct?
I think it's probably more
Mm.
if we look at what they actually have to allocate. I mean, they can't take everyone.
Yeah.
You still need someone to go around in the barracks and do stuff, or take care of basic training, or take care of the conscripts. But we often hear numbers that are somewhere between 5 and 600,000 Russians
Mm.
currently engaged in Ukraine. So it's quite a significant force. And if we look at what do they have of conscripts, they have about 250,000 conscripts right now. And some of them will be very sort of fresh into training, but a significant number of them will be also in the last 6 months, where they would be quite, they've basically gone through the training and they are ready to fight. So maybe Russia could fairly easily find another 100,000 soldiers, for example, by just starting to use the conscripts. And they actually also have right now a discussion about doubling the conscription time in Russia. So going from 12 months and back to 24 months as it was in the old days. So that would also very quickly just double the number of conscripts currently serving. So um, I think it's possible that Russia could maybe, by taking that step, get to say 700,000 or something like that they could use in the war. The big problem for them about growing the force really is equipment. So if they go out and have broad mass mobilization, they could probably take another 300,000 men out of the workforce, we can say, but where are they going to find all the equipment that these people will need in order to be actually efficient soldiers? I think
Exactly.
that's the really big problem they have, that they can sort of sustain the level that they have now, but they don't really have what it would take to significantly grow the force with the kind of attrition level that we have now. Of course, if there is some kind of break in the war, some kind of ceasefire thing, then we should not underestimate what Russia is able to do production-wise. Because if they stop having losses on the front line, then they will be able to grow quite significantly the pool of equipment that they have. But as long as the attrition is so high, then they're really struggling to keep up.
There's been speculation about Russia potentially resorting to unconventional warfare. But as we know, there are problems with Putin firing off tactical nuclear weapons in defense of his country or in his continued prosecution of his offensive in the Donbass. Problems like raising the ire of his ally, Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. Considering this, how plausible is the use of chemical weapons by Russia in this context, and what could be the strategic rationale behind such a decision, especially in Kursk?
We actually see quite a bit of chemical warfare already, and it's something that I think we don't talk enough about, but it's in, I guess, what we could call the mild end of things. So it's not
Right.
really supposed to be lethal gas, but it's things like tear gas that you would throw into the Ukrainian trenches. You would force people to leave the trench, and then you can shoot them with conventional artillery or other kinds of weapons. And that is absolutely against all kinds of international law to do that. You know that is on paper, it's just as bad as using sarin or something like that. So it's definitely something Russia is doing, and I guess we can say that it's something that would be. I mean, I guess they would have to, if they have taken that step, then we should expect them to also be thinking about using other kinds of gases. The problem about it is that it's really hard to use, I mean, to create a big effect on the front line. I mean, and that's also I guess, what we saw in World War I. Really, it did not actually win the war for either side, that we had these gases flowing around. And I think Russia would struggle with the same thing on the front line today. So it would be, where would they do that to achieve a military effect that would really be significant? If they do it and it angers the world community, that right now we can say they use chemical weapons on the level of tear gas, which is also illegal, but it's sort of below a kind of threshold where I guess the world community can kind of ignore it and or say that it doesn't really change our understanding of the war as a whole. But if Russia starts using chemical weapons like World War I kind of thing, then that might be something that could galvanize Western support for Ukraine, and really backfire on the Russians, that it could lead the Western countries to deliver weapons to Ukraine where it would be a net loss for Russia. And the other thing, of course, they could do with these kinds of things would be these kind of terror things, right? If you throw a bunch of this at civilian objects, then, I mean, that would, of course, create a lot of horror. But again, I think it would just backfire too much. And that's why I'd say I think the current level is probably what we're going to see continue. That it's this use of different kinds of tier agents, and then in combination with conventional weapons. So I don't think it's a joker that they can really throw into the Kursk region. And another, we can say what's also, it would be interesting to see if it makes a difference for Russia in their calculations that Kursk is actually Russia. So if they start using these things, it will actually be Russian civilians that are in these cities that are exposed to it. I'm not sure it will make much of a difference, but yeah, I don't know. I'd hope they think about it.
Well, I'd hope to think about it as well, but I don't know. There's this sort of casual attitude with regard to the Russian government and the way it thinks about its people. And here we can stretch it all the way back to Tsarist times. You know, people are people to be exploited by the elites any which way they like. There's probably a little bit of truth to that, but it's also a bit dangerous overstretching and going down that path, because you end up stereotyping and getting all kinds of wrong-headed ideas about the complexities of the battlefield. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From Copenhagen, Denmark, we're speaking with Anders Puck Nielsen, a Royal Danish Navy commander, a military analyst at the Royal Danish Defence College, and host of a Conflict and War YouTube channel. Anders, how have international stakeholders reacted to the Kursk incursion? What shifts in alliances and military support might we expect due to these developments that we've just been discussing?
I guess we can start with I think the most obvious thing is that we have really not seen any Western countries coming out against the Ukrainians, which I'd say personally, when this started on the first day, I thought, I think as everyone else thought, I thought this is probably one of those raids that we've seen before. Then it turns out it wasn't. But my first instinct was to assume that this is something the Ukrainians would have done with weapons that they had from the old Soviet stockpiles, right? Because the Western countries probably wouldn't want to see Western tanks and other kinds of vehicles driving around inside of Russia. But very quickly, it became obvious that this is the Western equipment, and we did not see any kind of protests from the Western countries. In fact, I think on like day 3, the Americans came out with a new weapons package for Ukraine. So they announced a huge new shipment of new stuff to the Ukrainians. And so clearly there's been from the Western countries support for this step, which I think is interesting because not that long ago, at least I'd say the Americans and the Germans would have been very concerned about this. But we've seen both American and German equipment here. And I think there's still I don't know if it's, there is still a discussion, let's put it that way, about how much the Western countries knew beforehand. Both the Ukrainians and the Western countries say they didn't know anything. This was a surprise to them as well. But I don't know. I think at least on a policy level, there must have been discussions about, can we actually use German vehicles to do this? Can we use American vehicles here? Can we use HIMARS here? Is it within the limits here? Because we really haven't seen any kind of backlash against the Ukrainians there. And then I guess from just another thing this has done is that it has re-energized the belief in Ukraine's possibilities in the war. There's been a long period with a narrative that it's just, this is an impossible fight. The Ukrainians are doing great, but in the end, they will have to make a deal because Russia is just, it's just too strong an enemy to be up against. And what we're seeing now is suddenly that there is a different kind of narrative where, well, it's maybe there is actually a possibility here, and we can see that the Russians are struggling, and we will have to see. But I don't know. I think that's the most interesting developments, I'd say. The absolute lack of criticism and lack of talks about dangerous escalation and those sorts of things,
Yeah.
and then a new energy in the support for Ukraine.
Do you think while the Russians are stumbling around trying to find an answer to the Ukrainian incursion, that this gives Ukraine a golden opportunity to try to expand as far and as wide into Russian territory as possible? Or do you think that the Ukrainian incursion is about as big as it will get because of the very real limitations that the Ukrainian armed forces are having to struggle with themselves?
I think we will see them trying to continue expanding along the border, creating. Zelensky talked about a buffer zone, a bit of trolling of Putin, right? Who said he would establish
Yeah.
a buffer zone on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
But basically, that's the most sustainable thing, to stay
Mm.
close to your own border. But as long as Ukraine can do that, as long as they can continue expanding, I think they're going to do that. Um, the important thing is also to note that the Ukrainians still have to guard the border or the front line, regardless where it is. So it's not necessarily that much more costly for them to move the front line a bit forward and then stay there. I don't think we're going to see them go very deep, but definitely as we're recording this, there is still this whole area that seems to be cut off, about 700 square kilometers, where Ukraine has blown all the bridges, and
Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely an area that I think we're going to see the Ukrainians taking within the coming weeks. And then I guess they will try to just expand, as long as the Russians don't react, really, as long as they don't send sufficient forces to the area to stop this. I think we're going to see the Ukrainians trying to just make the problem bigger for
Yeah.
the Russians by just expanding.
So, Anders, let's see if we can go into Ukraine's calculation for having launched this offensive. Obviously, there was the very real need to try to relieve some of the pressure against Ukrainian defenders along the Donbass region. So there was that. But then there was also the very real threat posed by a potential election of Donald Trump, where he said very clearly he was quite happy, and actually his vice president as well seemed very hostile toward Ukraine. And they're quite happy to cut off Ukraine from a supply of American weapons because these guys like Vladimir Putin for some reason. However, was that the only reason? Because, you made mention that the strike in has helped galvanize Ukrainian support that had been flagging because, the last year has been pretty trying for them. Um, but there has to be that kind of real reason for why they wanted to go in. I mean, it's an expenditure of manpower that was quite risky, and it could have gone so badly wrong for them had they misstepped. What do you think?
I think those two reasons are actually important, about diverting Russian forces, trying to force the Russians to spread out, that the Russians won't have the luxury of just having an entire section of the front line being just unguarded.
Yeah.
That because going forward, the Russians can't just allow themselves to just focus all the forces in the part of the front line that is inside Ukraine. They will have to also focus on the other thing. That's one of them. I think also definitely this thing about making sure they have a bargaining chip if Donald Trump is elected. But I think in the big perspective, it's important to see this as a step in a long-term process or trend that goes toward moving the war into Russian territory. And it started really last year for real, when the Ukrainians seemed to refine the drone technology enough that they could have these long-range strikes into Russia. We've seen the raids before, where they've tried to sort of go into Russia and make a bit of trouble and they go out again. But really, this is the trend, that the Ukrainians want to move the war into Russia, because that creates pressure on Putin. And it is a kind of pressure that forces him to eventually enter negotiations that with a mindset where it's actually realistic to reach anything. Because the problem is, so far, Putin has talked a lot about negotiations, but it's basically negotiations about the sort of how Ukraine can surrender unconditionally and just give Russia everything they want. That's been the basis for this. If they want Putin to actually also go into negotiations with a willingness to make concessions, to make compromises, then there has to be a domestic pressure on Putin. So I think we need to see it as a step in that direction of trying to just turn up the heat under Putin. And the short-term reaction, of course, from Putin, and that everyone seems to be reacting to right now, is that Putin has said that now it's absolutely impossible to have any kinds of negotiations. So all perspectives of that are closed. But I think that was also the case before. Before he was just talking about, negotiations as a kind of trolling, that he would be absolutely happy to see the Ukrainians just surrender. But what he's facing now is that if he wants this war to end, he will actually have to go into real negotiations that also involve getting Russian territory back.
How do you see Putin's position at the moment as the supreme commander of this enterprise? I mean, he suffered I suppose you could say, a military rebellion last year. I mean, had he not had the Prigozhin uprising and the march to Moscow, perhaps he would be in a stronger position with regard to the Kursk incursion. But because he had already that sort of undercurrent of even his own forces not necessarily being behind him, and then the following year he ends up having this foreign force ensconced in the Kursk Oblast, surely there must be mounting political pressure on Putin from those who are supporting him politically. I mean, I can't imagine that Putin supporters will be happy about this situation.
No, definitely there is pressure on Putin, and just one of the examples we can, or one of the ways we can see that this is actually a political crisis for him, is that he disappeared, because that is a classical tactic that Putin uses when there is bad news, that he just disappears from public view for a long time, and then he comes back when things seem to have settled down. But I will say the problem is that there is no alternative to Putin, and he has been very good at creating these circumstances, of course, over his time in power in Russia. So it's always difficult when we talk about the stability of Russia, because on the one hand, it looks rock solid, and it is solid, but only until the day it isn't, right? And these transitions can go very quickly. And I think that is also the overall direction of Russia is also towards some kind of transition away from the current system, because it's not a sustainable way to run Russia. But it can take a long time. We don't know. I mean, it might be soon. It might be. It might take a long time. It might even take a longer time than Putin is alive before this happens. But I think definitely the war has sped up that process. It has accelerated the process towards some kind of collapse that might look like the collapse of the Soviet Union, that might look like something else. We don't know what the situation will be like, but definitely the Putin system is weaker than it might look, and frankly, I think some of the concerns about escalation that we see from Western countries, for example, from the United States, we have Jake Sullivan, who seems to be one of the leading sort of proponents of this escalation management approach to the war. I think a lot of the concern about escalation is actually not related to the idea that Putin, out of a position of strength, will get really angry and retaliate against the West, and that can lead to escalation, but that we can see a kind of collapse of the Russian system where Putin will be acting out of desperation and that can lead to escalation. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that on the one hand, Russia has strength, Russia has ability, but it's also a weak system. We might suddenly see rapid political uncertainty collapse even, and it can be dangerous. And it's not really something we can necessarily control, but we can say as long as this war continue, then it probably moves in that direction. And if I can just add one more thing, I think we need to understand about the way Putin is running the war is he is running the war out of how he sees the world, the information he has, and Putin has been so long in power now that we're seeing many of the weaknesses that dictatorships can have. Like this, the person in top of the system maybe doesn't have the right picture of how things are going. We have people telling the boss what they think the boss wants to hear, and also Putin is his idea, his basic assumptions about how the world works are such that Russia is a great power, Ukraine is absolutely not a great power. So he has this rock solid belief that, okay, this seems to be a lot more trouble than we were hoping for, but in the end, Russia is absolutely going to win because there is no other outcome here. And I think that's not rationally a correct assessment of how things are, but I think that's the assumption that Putin is acting from. And that's why he's continuing this war despite us from the outside looking at it and say, this is not rational. The rational thing to do would be to sort of shut this down and do what's best for Russia.
Well, basically, Anders, I think that you'd agree that dictatorships, generally speaking, however they're constructed and whoever's on top, they're brittle systems and they're quite unpredictable because, as you rightly point out, you don't know how long they're going to be there in their position of authority until they're not. And the public are a fickle beast, which then leads me to another thing before we return to Ukraine itself. But when we looked at, or when I started looking at this whole Kursk incursion, the first thing that crossed my mind, of course, was World War II. The Nazis are coming. Where is this great patriotic war fervor that I was expecting to see from the Russians? It seems to be a rather muted form of Russian nationalism that's on display, if it's on display at all anywhere. I was expecting a far stronger Russian popular rally around the flag moment. I haven't seen that yet, although, mind you, whatever we get in the West from the Russian side of things is pretty much, well, nothing. So it may be happening. It's just out of camera view. But what are your thoughts and what are your observations about that?
The way Putin has built his power base in Russia is that essentially he has separated political life from private life. So he has established his rule on this idea that normal people should not be engaged in politics. Yeah. So if you just take care of your own business, you can do whatever you want, right? You can build a business, you can have the job you want, you can take the education you want, you can have your kids, you can go on vacation, you can send your kids to universities abroad, all of these things. Just stay out of politics. But if you get engaged in politics, then all kinds of bad things will hit you, right? And this is what the Russian people have been living in for decades, and it has worked very well. Most Russians do not consider themselves engaged in politics at all. Yeah. They don't see themselves as people having political agency, that their opinion matters, right? So they might have an opinion about what's going on, but it doesn't really matter what I think because I don't make the decisions anyways, or they just don't follow the news. A surprising number of Russians don't follow the news about the war because they're just tired of it and they try to ignore it because it just makes them feel bad. Yeah. So what we typically we say that about 15 to 20% of the Russian population are what we could call have a mindset that would be Western liberal kind of mind. These are the people, the Navalny's of Russia, right? These are the people that want to have a system like we have in the West, liberal democracies and stuff. Then we have 15 to 20% that are the ultra nationalists. So these are the Z blockers and the people here screaming about the greatness of Russia. And then we will have about 60 to 70% of the population that just absolutely try to stay apolitical, don't really have an opinion about anything. Just I mind my own business and hope that the government won't interfere. So that is actually why we don't see a stronger reaction from the Russian people in either direction.
Yeah.
That is why we don't see strong anti-war movements, for example, because most people will just say, it's not really my business. But it's also why we don't see this rally around the flag kind of thing, because it's not really people tend to see, well, I do my thing, then the government, I mean, that's for other people. And this is actually equally a problem for those in the West who would like Russians to stand up against the Putin system, or the Russian opposition that try to mobilize people against the Putin system, go on the streets and make protests, these kinds of things. They try to politicize the Russian, to make the Russians see their agency. But it's actually suddenly Putin has the same project. He also now needs people to get politically engaged, but it's for the opposite cause, right? It's this fighting for Russia, the greatness of Russia, uniting the Russian people, and all that. So suddenly the system that Putin has created, where he basically, parks 70% of the population out on the sideline, it doesn't work for him anymore if he wants people to go and sacrifice. And that's also why this discussion about the use of conscripts is so contentious in Russia, because these people have not volunteered to be there. And that suddenly means that Putin sort of breaks the societal contract, you can say, with the Russian people, that they get to, if they just stay out of politics, then he will stay out of their life. Suddenly that doesn't work anymore. I think a lot in this war will actually depend on how successful the Russian government will be in mobilizing the Russian population. Sometimes people use the word fascize, I guess, and we could discuss whether that is correct, but definitely to get them more politically engaged and to see that whatever they do is actually important for a bigger cause.
All right, Anders. Just leveraging off your insights and playing a little bit of hypothetical here. At the moment, it seems that in terms of the available units around the Kursk salient, there may be more conscripts than, hardened veterans from down south. So I'm kind of wondering what the public backlash against Putin will be if the Ukrainians hit these conscripts really hard. I mean, that's not going to reverberate well in the Kremlin, I would imagine, because again, you're absolutely right. Putin's now in danger of breaking his social contract with the people. The people are ambivalent about whether or not they want their young men and women in uniform to go off and fight the enemy. If the enemy then strikes at them and, Putin does not a lot, or doesn't pull back some of the hardened forces from the Donbass area to rectify that sort of social issue that he's got going with his people, it could lead to some very interesting times ahead, I would imagine.
I think so too. It's one of those questions where it's really possible that this can lead to real protests in Russia, and something that could threaten the stability of the regime. And I also think it's an important step in the war, we can say, before the war can end. this is probably one of the things that will have to happen before there will be enough domestic pressure on Putin that he will want to really go into negotiations with a mindset that about also making compromises on his side.
Yeah.
So I think the real problem for them will not be if these couple of thousand conscripts that are there already are hit. I mean, it's a number that they can probably get away with. The challenge will be when they start really sending more conscripts from other units that are not there already into the fight, because that will suddenly mean that it's not those that just happen to be there by more or less accident that were the unlucky ones, but that it's everyone that can be hit by this. Every conscript can be hit by this. And that means that the family of every conscript will be worried. It's the family of every young Russian man that will go into conscription next year or the year after that. Everyone will be worried. So suddenly you can have really a lot of people around Russia that will that might be mobilized against that. And that's also why we're seeing them going ahead so gradually, not taking any big steps in just rushing into sending the conscripts there. They know they need to prepare the population for this move. They know that it will take time for this idea to sink in and before people will accept it. Because because you're absolutely right. I think if they start doing that, then we're going to see a very large number of them losing their lives or being taken as prisoners of war.
Absolutely. Anders, final couple of questions. The first of which, I'd like to get your sense. I mean, we've unpacked Putin, we've unpacked the Russian army, and we've certainly unpacked in the last section, the connection between Putin, his society, and how the war will progress forward. But very few people give much thought to how the exact same things are playing out on the ground in Ukraine. Now, we've had Ukraine come out of a year of being beaten down, of having relatively low morale. And now all of a sudden they've got their dander up and it's like, yay, we're in Russia. We're bringing the war home to the Russians. It's about time. What are the social processes that you know of that are going on inside Ukraine that is shoring up Zelensky's leadership and also ensuring that Zelensky has his people behind him to continue prosecuting this war, which is still not going too well in the Donbass, as you said earlier?
Absolutely, we are seeing that on the Ukrainian side, there are more and more discussions about what is a realistic end state in this. I think I hear more and more Ukrainians talking about the sort of Finnish solution, where the Winter War, Finland basically won their independence, but they actually ended up losing some territory in the process, and that maybe something like that would be a meaningful end result for Ukraine, so that the goal is not necessarily to get everything back, but maybe just some of it. But I think in the end, the important thing is that there was also an opinion poll, for example, recently that showed that a growing number of Ukrainians believe that it could maybe be okay to give some land for peace. But the important thing is that these things are always connected to the question about security guarantees, so that Russia will never be able to invade Ukraine again.
Yeah.
And I think that is still an open question, how exactly that would look, right? How would we actually get Russia to accept any kind of deal where that happened? I think in the big perspective, it's actually more important for Russia that Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO than that they get these territories. The war. This is ultimately not a war about territory. It's a war about NATO expansion. It's a war about political control over all of Ukraine. So, I mean, so we have we have these emerging discussions in Ukraine about what it will take and what possibilities could there be about a road to peace that doesn't involve just getting everything back. But at the same time, I would say we're not at a point where that is at all a realistic option that is on the table for the Ukrainians at this point.
Yeah.
And maybe the Kursk incursion can be seen as a step toward maybe making that more viable. If mounting the kind of pressure on Putin that would actually make it possible to create a peace where Ukraine does have these security guarantees.
Okay, final question, Anders, and this is a bit of an indulgence for me. As a Navy man, you must be fascinated by Ukraine's ability to fend off the Russian Black Sea Fleet without a navy. What are the likely implications of this on the future of naval warfare? Should governments start scrapping their high-cost crewed vessels in favor of jet skis and uncrewed drones?
It's a super fascinating discussion. On the one hand, we can say that this has definitely demonstrated how efficient these weapons types are. And there is no, I can't see any way that the Russian Navy can bounce back from this in the Black Sea. So the direction is clear about this. The problem about it is that it is a sea denial kind of weapon, right? You can, with these types of drones, both airborne, the maritime drones, you can deny the enemy the access to the use of the sea, but you can't really use the sea yourself. And I think the big challenge also that many navies around the world will have to face right now is, what would we have done if we had been in the position that Russia is in, right? We can all cheer at the Ukrainians and say, this is great, but how are we going to solve that problem when someone sends those things against our ships, right?
Yeah.
I'm just
thinking about Africa, and I'm thinking of the Gulf of Guinea. That'd be a nice place to start playing around with concepts like that. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And now, what are we going to do in 10 years when the Houthis have these things, right?
Correct.
They already have ballistic missiles. They're going to get these things. Or how are we going to actually, what is the U.S. Navy going to do in Southeast Asia about this when they face these things? It is something that if you want to come and establish sea control, you really need an answer to this, and we just don't have the answers at this moment. So I don't think it's time to scrap all your big capital vessels, but we definitely need to understand how we protect them better, and we just don't have the answers at this point.
Commander Anders Puck Nielsen, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thanks for inviting me.
That was Anders Puck Nielsen of the Royal Danish Navy discussing his insights into the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Anders Puck Nielsen. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Anders and connect with him on social media. What do you think about the Ukrainian Kursk incursion? Is it a strategic masterstroke or a grand gamble bordering on folly? Do you think distracting the Russian main force from in the Donbass will have the desired effect of relieving pressure on the Ukrainian defenders there? Let us know in the comments section. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.